There's this prince. He grew up in incredible privilege, but inside that royal gilded cage, he was never allowed to be himself. They were traumatized kids. Their mother died, and they grew up in a family that was very dysfunctional.
I wanted to start off today talking about this mental health epidemic that we're living through. Latest statistics in the UK are these. 1 in 6 adults above the age of 16 report moderate to severe depressive symptoms. That's not mild, that's just moderate to severe. And over 8 million people in the UK experience an anxiety disorder at any one time. From your perspective, what's going on?
Well, and if I may add, the similar statistics, even more so, are evident in North America as well, where the rate of children's suicide is going up, and the number of kids being medicated, seriously medicated for all manner of conditions is going up, where 25% of women are on a psychoactive medication of some kind, where depression, anxiety are rising, where overdoses. In the United States last year, more people died of overdoses than in America's Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghan wars put together, almost twice as many in 1 year. So the mental health issue, and this is United States, May is Mental Health Month, is an increasing burden on society and on individuals. So it really means we have to rethink our perspective on mental health and mental illness. Because the traditional medical view has it that it's a biological problem in the brain, usually potentiated by genetics. But if that was the case, it wouldn't be rising like the way it is, because genes don't change in a population over a short period of time. So we really have to look at broader social factors as they bear upon the individual. And the truth is that the individual cannot be separated from the environment. We're social creatures. And the functioning of our brains and our physiology is very much affected by our context. And so the question we really have to be asking is what is happening in modern society that is increasing the psychological burden on human beings?
Your latest book is called The Myth of Normal. And I think that title is incredibly apt in relation to what we're talking about. We've got to a stage now in 2023 where it's almost normal to have some level of mental health dysfunction. So from your perspective, what exactly is going on in society that is so stigmatizing, that is so toxic for our physical, mental, and emotional well-being?
Yes. Well, for that, we have to go back and ask the question, what are the needs of human beings for healthy development? And to what degree does our society or any society meet those needs? And this begins already in uterus, because we already know that stresses on pregnant women during the gestational period affect the brain development of infants in utero already. So the more stress there is on a woman when they're pregnant, the greater the risk that child is for mental health problems later on. It starts that early. And then we have to look at childbirth practices themselves, because the way nature set up childbirth, it wasn't just a matter of pushing a baby out of a womb. It was also a bonding experience chemically. A whole cocktail of hormones is released in the woman and the baby, oxytocin, endorphins, vasopressin, that help the bonding between mother and infant. Now, with the rising rates of intervention, unnecessary intervention, sometimes, as you and I know as physicians, obstetrical intervention is life-saving for mother and infant, and it's to be celebrated. But when we have situations where here in my province of British Columbia, there's a 40% cesarean section rate, and this is generalizing across the industrialized world. Sometimes it's even higher. We're having a massive interference with the natural process. And then we have to ask, what are the essential needs of human children for healthy development? And They include a safe, secure attachment relationship with parents who are emotionally attuned and present for them, which is increasingly difficult for parents to provide in today's stressed society. It includes the child not having to work to make the relationship work, so the child can be at rest in a relationship. It includes the freedom of the child to experience and express all their emotions. So the human brain is wired, like all mammals are wired, for certain emotions, including joy, playfulness, curiosity, grief, fear, anger. When parenting practices inhibit a child from experiencing all their emotions, that interferes with the child's brain development. And so take something like depression, just a simple example. What does it mean to depress something? It means to push it down. What gets pushed down in depression? But why would somebody push down their emotions? Because they weren't allowed to express them, because the expression of emotion threatened their relationship with their parents. And a lot of parenting practices today encourage parents to force kids to suppress their emotions.
Yeah.
And so there's so much where our needs are not met. And the biggest factor, I would say, Rangan, is the stress on parents.
Yeah.
The economic, social stress on parents and the increasing social isolation. All of these bear upon the developing child.
So much there to pick up on, Gabor. I think in one of our previous conversations, I mentioned to you a case of a young lady who I saw in my first week in general practice who had symptoms consistent with depression. And it would have been very easy to diagnose her with depression, label her, and then put her on an antidepressant. But I won't retell that entire story, but over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, by seeing her every week, by listening to her compassionately, non-judgmentally, in a way that she didn't have outside the consultation room, her symptoms just started to resolve. And that really speaks to what you said about depression. We're depressing our feelings down. And I'm looking at that case now through that lens. I simply provided a safe space where she could start to undepress those feelings, elevate those feelings, get them out. And as if by magic, her symptoms started to get better. So, yeah, I think that's a really nice way of thinking about depression. I just wanted to talk to you, though, about brain development. You mentioned there, your central thesis behind your book, to me at least, is that the culture around us is making us sick, right? This is not really an individual issue. This is a societal and environmental issue. And then, so if we then look at various aspects of modern society, at least modern Western society, when mothers and parents are having children these days, it's later than it used to be. It's often mid, late 20s, maybe into 30s, maybe sometimes into early 40s. This often coincides with them trying to make their way in their careers. Two parents working, they've moved away from home, they don't have support around them. So they're actually trying to incubate a baby inside the womb at a very stressful time. Often they're pushing themselves to try and buy a house where they can have a little garden and have room for the little one. Society doesn't make it easy for us to have that calm, relaxed, attentive environment for the woman when she's pregnant or for the children when they're born, does it?
No, and I wonder, Rangan, when you were in medical school, when you were taught prenatal care, did anybody ever suggest to you that you pay attention to the emotional needs of the pregnant mother? I wasn't taught that either. And yet, as I've already mentioned, that's a huge influence. Now, let me quote to you an article from Harvard University, and it talked about brain development. And I'm going to quote it as best I can. It said that the architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process that begins before birth, continues into adulthood, and establishes either a fragile or sturdy foundation for all the health and learning that behavior that follow. So that the architecture of the brain is constructed to an ongoing process beginning before birth, continuing into adulthood, which means that in any process of development, you have to have the right conditions from before birth to adulthood. That's the first point. The second point is most important influence on the development of the brain is the emotional mutuality in the relationship between parents and children, especially in the early childhood years. Now, lots of studies have shown that when parents are busy, they're stressed, they're anxious, they're economically pressured, that interferes with their capacity to emotionally connect with their children. We're not blaming parents here. They're doing their best, but they're doing their best in an abnormal environment. Abnormal from the point of view of human development, because human creatures, we evolved in a communal context where parents had lots of support, lots of companionship, and kids were always surrounded by other kids and by adults who cared for them. That's how we evolved. That's our need. Now, if you get a society that increasingly isolates and stress parents, that's going to impact the very circuitry of the child's brain. And that's going to affect the child's psychological functioning.
Yeah.
So that we know from British studies, for that matter, that mothers who are depressed, their kids are more likely to have ADHD later on. Why? Because the parents' emotional states affect the brain development of the child, and therefore the psychological development of the child as well. So what we cannot do is to separate the environment from the physiology of the brain. So in modern psychiatry, which really looks at mental health conditions, there's biological problems. The point they don't get and they ignore is that the brain's biology itself is affected by and shaped by the emotional and social context. And so when you have increasing isolation, parents who are stressed, struggling, as you say, without the community to support them anymore, with the loss of connection, of course you're going to get a lot of kids who are going to be mentally challenged and emotionally in trouble. Of course you are.
Given how important those formative years are, it would seem relatively urgent that we try and restructure elements of society to really prioritize those early years. So I know in America, I read a recent statistic that is it 25% of women within 2 weeks of giving birth are back at work. I mean,
yes.
If that is true, that's an absolutely incredible and actually very worrying statistic, and really shows us what that society is valuing and putting first. I'm interested, though, if we compare that to, let's say, Scandinavian countries where there's less financial inequality as there may be, let's say, in America. There's, I think, 9 months in some of these Scandinavian countries, 9 months of paternal leave, same amount, if not longer, maternal leave. You know, clearly as a society, we're saying, or they're saying, oh, the first 9 months are very, very important. So I'm interested, number one, do we see less rates of mental health problems in cultures like that? Perhaps we could address that first, and then I'll go into the next point.
Well, I wish I knew about Scandinavian statistics. There are significant mental health problems in the Scandinavian countries as well. But Finland, for example, is considered to be the happiest country in the world, according to a recent study. And they have very different approaches to childrearing and schooling and so on. In the Scandinavian countries, there is trauma, and you know, it's not that they're without their problems.
No.
But they don't nearly have the rate of children being medicated or adults being medicated that North America does. Now, when mothers are forced to return to work at such a high rate for economic reasons, what that amounts to is a massive abandonment of children. Important for the biological, physiological, and mental development of the child to have skin-to-skin contact with the mother. In our society, increasingly, that's less and less available.
Yeah.
That actually has an impact on the child's sense of security and safety in the world. No wonder we have rising rates of anxiety.
Yeah. Another element of culture I've really been reflecting on recently, Gabor, is about this idea of kids living with their parents. Now, it's really interesting. I'm from an Indian background. So I remember in the summers when I'd go to India and spend 6 weeks with my family, you'd have joint families, extended families, 3, 4 generations living in the same house. Now, I'm not saying everything was fantastic about that. There's pros and cons with everything in life. But I was chatting to my wife a few weeks ago saying, where did this idea come from that if you're still living with your parents at age 20 or 21, you're somehow a failure in life? It seems to be a very Western idea that I absorbed as a child that I think is there. You'll see social media posts, you'll see things online where if someone at 26 is still living at home, they're almost frowned upon in this society. And again, I've just been reflecting as to where did that come from? I'm not saying necessarily we shouldn't be promoting independence. We shouldn't be encouraging people to, once they've had their child rearing, to move on with their adult lives with that strong degree of independence. But have you reflected on this? Where did this idea come from? And what do we see in tribes and more native cultures?
Well, in our society, there's a real push on parents to drive their kids towards independence, so that even at an early age, we try and push them towards independence. Mm-hmm. We think that we have to foster independence in the child by kind of pushing them away. And this enters into a lot of parenting practices. Now, actually, we forget something, which is that independence is nature's natural agenda. So if you look at bears, nature's agenda is that at some point the baby bear, the cub, grows up independent and goes off on their own and no longer dependent on the mother. The mother doesn't have to push them towards independence. Nature does that. It's in the agenda of nature that we develop into independent creatures because at some point our parents will die. And so each generation needs to find its own independence. But it does so at a natural pace, consistent with its own nature. The way you actually foster independence in human children is by inviting dependence, is by meeting, because the human child is very dependent. If you meet the child's needs, we don't trust nature in the society is what it is. If you meet the child's needs for dependence and belonging and connection and attachment, that child will automatically develop a sense of independence because it's in the child's nature to do so.
Yeah. So
we don't have to push it. On the contrary, it's not that we should coddle kids and so kind of hobble them and infantilize them. You just have to meet their genuine attachment needs, give them a sense of security. They will naturally move towards independence, exploration, finding their own way in the world. So this is another thing that in our society we totally miss. And then we push our kids out. We expect them to find their way. Older societies used to have rituals for inviting children into adulthood. These rituals would exist in virtually all traditional cultures. We have lost those rituals. So we've lost a lot of the map that would guide people to be genuine human beings in our culture.
Yeah.